Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. The belt that became too loose. They say hunger wears many faces, some visible, others subtle. That particularly dry autumn, when the barns echoed more than they stored grain, I noticed something strange while getting dressed. My old leather belt, soft from years of use, seemed to slip more easily around my waist. At first I thought it was a distraction. Maybe the leather had stretched over time, as everything does in life. But deep down, I knew. We always know, even when we choose not to. In the kitchen, the aroma of porridge was the same as always, though thinner. My children still smiled around the bowl, licking the edges with delight, and my wife, ever attentive, served me with that look that says everything without a word. When I casually mentioned that maybe the belt was loosening, she just smiled sideways and said I must be working less, maybe even aging. It was a joke, but behind the laughter lived a tired tenderness and something more. That night before sleeping, I ran my fingers over the belt hanging from the nail on the wall. The old buckle marks were still there, deep, firm, memories from a time when my body was fuller and our days more abundant. Now the buckle settled 2 holes farther along. I sighed softly, not out of sadness but recognition. In the dim light of the room, the sound of my children's breathing mixed with the soft rustling of the straw mattress. They slept with full bellies, or full enough, and that was what mattered. My wife turned slowly, eyes still closed, and whispered something barely audible. "Tomorrow I'll harvest the last carrots." She always spoke that way, like announcing small hopes. I said nothing. I just slid my hand over hers and let the silence finish the sentence. It was in that silence our pact lived, to pretend for each other that everything was as it had always been, even as the world tightened the seams of our routine with invisible fingers. In the days that followed, I began to notice other things. The clay bowl where she served the stew seemed wider, though it hadn't changed. The bread pieces were distributed with almost mathematical precision, one for each child, and discrete crumbs for her and me. But no one complained. It was as if everyone, at some deep and quiet level, understood that we were living between the lines, with unspoken gestures and choices tucked inside other choices. One afternoon, returning from the fields with the hoe on my shoulder, and my shoulders lighter than usual, I saw her hiding something in the fold of her skirt. A bit of cheese, maybe. I didn't ask. I just came in and commented that the sun felt softer and that the soil was finally yielding to our efforts. She nodded with a calm smile, like someone grateful for the kindness of skirting the truth. That day, there was no dinner for me, but the timid laughter of our children around the table was so abundant that I felt nourished just by hearing them. On a morning when the fog lingered longer than usual, I went to fetch firewood in the sparse southern woods. The cold bit at my fingers, and the branches cracked beneath my feet, brittle like biscuits forgotten in the oven. As I walked, I remembered older winters, the scents of thicker broths, the laughter around the fireplace, the weight of my body when it still filled the tight embrace of that belt. And yet, there was something nobler now in this forced lightness. It felt like, little by little, we were learning to live with less, without losing anything that truly mattered. When I returned, I found my wife kneeling near the stove, gently blowing on the surviving embers. Her hair, tied in a simple bun, held white strands that seemed to catch the morning light. She didn't hear me come in. I stood still, silently watching. There was such beauty in the way she cared for the small things, as if every piece of firewood were a secret, every spark a promise. And I realized with quiet serenity that loving someone also means this: pretending not to see their sacrifice so they can keep offering it with dignity. That same night, While the children slept curled up like kittens in a nest, I sat beside her by the warm hearth. There wasn't much to say. Words at times felt excessive when our silences already understood us so well. Still, I tried a joke, saying perhaps my belt was getting lazy, loosening on its own. She laughed with her eyes but didn't reply. Instead, she took needle and thread and began mending one of our eldest son's socks, the one who, just days ago, gave part of his porridge to the youngest, thinking no one had noticed. There, in the flickering light of the fire, the stitches she sewed looked almost like a silent prayer. I watched her for a long time, and an old tenderness, the kind that rises slowly, like water from deep wells, came to visit me. I thought of saying that I knew, that I saw the daily sacrifices, the portions she cut from her own plate, the eyes that pretended not to see the emptiness of our shelves. But I held back. Perhaps it was more beautiful this way, this silent pact between two souls who loved each other more than hunger itself. As the days passed, autumn began to bow before winter. The dry leaves, once dancing, now lay motionless on the hardened ground like unsent letters. Still, the cold felt less sharp inside our home, perhaps because of her constant presence, and the children who were learning, without knowing it, to live with little and love with plenty. One of them brought me a small polished stone, saying it was for good luck. I kept it in the pocket of my coat, beside the quiet pride of seeing my child offer in lean times what he valued most. One afternoon, as I swept the floor with slow, steady steps, my wife asked if I remembered when we used to share bread with the neighbors. I do, I said, and one day, who knows, we might share again. She nodded like someone watering an invisible seed, and returned to what she was doing. That memory, shared so lightly, felt like a blanket laid over the soul. And I realized that, even in times of absence, there was abundance wherever there was kindness. That night, as I adjusted my belt once again, I didn't feel loss. I felt honor. The following Sunday, the priest came to the village. He brought only a worn leather bag, and a blessing he repeated more to comfort than to heal. After Mass, many gathered in the small dirt square. Some spoke of delayed harvests, others of children who had left to seek fortune in distant cities. I stood beside her in silence, as usual. At some point, one of the neighbors mentioned I looked thinner. I laughed and replied that fieldwork was generous in that regard. She said nothing, but gently squeezed my hand, a small gesture, yet whole. Later, as we walked back home, she told me she had managed to trade some dried herbs for a piece of pork fat. I saved it for when the soup needs courage, she said. That echoed in me, soup with courage. That's what she did day after day. She seasoned next to nothing with hope, and made it feel like enough. When we arrived, the sky was turning a deep blue, with the first shy stars blinking above the thatched rooftops. Life was still hard, yes, but there was a kind of beauty that only came from care. And she was a master of that invisible craft. In the weeks that followed, the wind grew sharper and the branches barer, but inside the house there was warmth, not just from the firewood, but from the small gestures that kept us whole. The children began putting on little plays with patched-up rag dolls, and my wife would giggle softly when they improvised lines far too serious for their age. Sometimes, as I watched them play, I realized hunger could wait, but childhood could not. And she, with her quiet wisdom, knew exactly how to stretch good days even when food ran short. One night, when the sky looked made of stone and the roof tiles cracked with cold, I lingered on the doorstep before going in. I looked out at the sleeping fields, the furrows left by the hoe now covered by a thin layer of frost. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my thin chest, and realized there was still so much to be thankful for. I stepped inside slowly, unbuckled the belt carefully, and hung it on the same nail in the wall. It swayed lightly, as if it too carried memory. And in that moment I understood gently. Sometimes love is precisely that, loosening gently so the other can breathe. The next morning, as I dressed for work in the fields, I noticed the belt was no longer necessary. My pants, old and worn, rested naturally on my hips, as if they too had learned to adapt. I thought about leaving the belt where it was, hanging quietly. But for some reason I tied it anyway, not to hold up my clothes, but as one carries a symbol. That worn piece of leather, with its old marks and a new hole, was a portrait of all we had lived through and overcome without fanfare. At breakfast, she served me the same thin porridge as always, but with a touch of nutmeg we hadn't tasted in ages. We smiled at each other, complicit. With every spoonful, it felt like we were sharing not just the food, but the strength to carry on. Outside, the day began slowly, wrapped in fog, and inside, between the sound of spoons and the gentle clinking of chipped ceramics, there was a peace that cannot be bought, only cultivated. I understood then that even when life tightens, there are gestures that stretch the world. A few days later, coming home early from the fields, I found the house wrapped in soft silence. The children were all asleep, curled under a single blanket, and she was sewing on the doorstep, her bare feet touching the cold earth. She didn't see me arrive. The setting sun was gilding her hair and the fabric in her hands. I stood there for a moment, as one might while contemplating a daily miracle. At times I forgot how beautiful she was, not in a flashy way, but with the kind of beauty that blooms from perseverance. I sat beside her without saying a word. After some time, still guiding the needle through the cloth, she murmured, "I think you need a new belt." I smiled, not because it was funny, but because I understood what lay behind those words. I answered softly, almost like a prayer, "Maybe, but this one still fits. Just right." And we stayed there, both quiet, watching the sky dress in deep blue. Night came slowly, like truths that don't wound, only rest. That night I dreamed of our first home, that modest cabin made of salvaged wood where we began everything with little more than will. In the dream, the belt was still new and tightened firmly. I adjusted it with pride before heading to work, and she handed me a bundle of bread and cheese wrapped in blue cloth. I woke with a peaceful heart, as if I had visited a place where I had once been happy, and I realized the smell in the kitchen was real. Porridge with a drizzle of honey, a rare treat she saved for the coldest days. When she saw me come in, she said nothing. She simply pointed to the plate and returned to stirring a small pot over the fire. I sat down slowly and ate in silence, feeling the warmth of the food reach my chest before it ever reached my stomach. I thought about telling her I dreamed of the past, but decided to keep it to myself. Sometimes dreams, too, are like sacrifices, quiet, discreet, and made not to burden the other. Instead, I complimented the flavor and saw her eyes shine, as if it were the first harvest after a long winter. The next day she left early to help a neighbor who was ill. She left a simple note on the table. "I'll be back before the sun touches the roof. There's stale bread in the blue cloth." I smiled reading it, recognizing the same cloth from our early days, now faded but still faithful. The morning passed slowly, with the crowing of roosters and the rhythm of my footsteps in the yard. As I tended the tools, I noticed the belt buckle had come loose. I sat in the shade of the plum tree and began fixing it with a piece of wire, as if I were mending more than just an object. A story. When she returned, her eyes carried fatigue and her hands a bundle of fresh leaves. "Mint for tea," she said, and entered without fuss. I watched her movements and realized that love, our love, lived precisely there, in the constant weaving between what is missing and what remains. That night, we dined alone. The children were at their aunt's, and the silence felt vast, like a field without fences. Before bed, I loosened the now mended belt and hung it back on the nail, now with one extra fold. I felt it would keep serving for many years, even if it no longer tightened like before. Winter at last arrived with its thick breath and blue mornings. Frost embroidered the corners of the windows and turned fences into delicate sculptures. Inside the house, warmth was scarce but loyal. Firewood was rationed with wisdom, and every flame was watched like a secret. My children no longer asked for more food. They had learned, like little birds, to sing even in a modest nest. Sometimes we would sit together near the stove and tell old stories of days when corn grew tall and cakes baked on Sundays. One night, after everyone had fallen asleep, my wife showed me a bundle kept on the highest shelf of the cupboard. It was a new leather belt, thick and sturdy, made by her from the remnants of an old strap. "I made it when I noticed the other was getting tired," she said. I held it in my hands, heavy and well stitched, and felt a knot rise in my throat. I thanked her without words. Instead, I kissed her forehead and held her close for a long time, like someone who knows such gestures last longer than any abundance. The next morning, I put on the new belt with a kind of ceremonial care. It was still stiff, needing time to mold to the body and the years, but it would, as all things made with intention do. She watched me from the corner of her eye as she sliced thin potatoes into the pot and smiled when she saw me adjust the buckle gently. She said nothing. She didn't have to. In that quiet exchange was everything we had built, a life made of details, of firm patches and soft gestures. The old belt remained hanging by the door, on the same nail, now as a memory. I didn't throw it away. From time to time I would touch it, and in doing so, I remembered the days when it loosened without my saying so, and she understood without needing explanation. Hunger had passed, or at least rested for a while. The table had color again, and the children's laughter came with less effort now. But what sustained me most was knowing that even in the leanest days, we were never short of care, tenderness, and belts that knew exactly when to loosen. In the next season, the rains arrived. The land at last opened itself generously, and the green returned like a promise fulfilled. We planted again, this time with more hope than fear. Each seed we pressed into the soil carried the memory of a time of tightness, but also the certainty that we had endured, and endured together. My children grew more that year, not just in height, but in the way they looked at the world. They had learned the value of crumbs and the beauty found in silence, and she carried on with her faded apron and tireless hands like a guardian of everything that truly matters. One afternoon, as we harvested the first radishes, one of the boys asked me why I still kept that old belt. I answered with a smile, because it taught me that sometimes love speaks softly, and you can only hear it if you really listen. The boy didn't fully understand, but accepted the answer, as children do when they trust. And I knew then, right there among damp earth and the scent of fresh leaves, that some things don't need to be explained, only lived, with humility and patience. And that, in the end, this is what sustains us, the invisible bonds that loosen when the world tightens. The salt that was missing from the priest's supper. I remember that afternoon well. The sky painted in a comforting shade of grey, typical of late autumn, and the scent of damp leaves rising from the ground, mingling with the aroma of freshly lit firewood. In the little light stone parish where we served Father Benedito, everything moved at its usual pace. The bells rang lazily, the hens scratched solemnly in the courtyard, and the faithful left quiet offerings beneath the wooden altar. I was merely the youngest cook to pass through the church kitchen that year, with anxious hands and a heart still learning the rhythm of the pots. And it was there, between wooden spoons and fogged windows, that a simple absence led me, without meaning to create something that would last through many winters. On the shelf where the spices rested, small jars aligned like miniature saints, my hand searched in vain for the salt. There was saffron, vinegar, thyme, but no salt. Not a single grain. The nearest market had already shut its wooden doors, and running to the neighboring village was unthinkable with supper nearing and the soup already on the fire. For a moment, I froze there, caught between the boiling pot and the emptiness of the clay jar. There was no one to blame, just the distraction of a long afternoon and the trade of one who sometimes gets lost in her own thoughts. Still, the priest's supper could not fail. I took a deep breath, as if seeking counsel in the silence, and let my eyes wander through the kitchen. I remembered my grandmother's words, that when the cupboard lacked something, the soul's imagination would suffice. I grabbed a handful of dried marjoram leaves, crushed them between my fingers until they released their warm, earthy scent, and let them fall into the soup with a careful, almost ceremonial gesture. A splash of vinegar, once used only for pickling cucumbers, slid timidly from the bottle, and as a final touch, I made the sign of the cross over the steaming pot, not from habit, but as one who asks permission from the unexpected. The aroma that rose was not the usual one. It was sharper, bolder, with notes of forest and sourdough. I stood there, tasting bit by bit, stirring with a spoon whose handle had a crack, trying to find meaning in the mixture. It wasn't what the priest expected, certainly, but it wasn't bad either. It was new, something between a mistake and a triumph, like a letter written in haste but sent with care. The bread was still warm, the cheese rested quietly on the board, and the candles were being lit in the refectory. Supper would come, with or without salt. When Father Benedito entered the dining hall, with his slow steps and the serene expression of one who carries many secrets and few urgencies, I had already set the table with the care one gives to an altar. The linen cloth had a tear I hid beneath a jar of hydrangeas, and the tin cutlery gleamed as if it were real silver. He sat, as always, with a long sigh and closed eyes for the first blessing, and I, nearby, barely breathed. My heart beat so loudly I feared it might drown out the clink of the spoon in the bowl. He tasted one spoonful, paused, then another, slower. He raised his eyebrows, and for a moment I feared he might ask for an explanation. But no, he simply smiled, a small smile, but one that lit the room like the timid flames of the candles. "Interesting," he said, more to himself than to me. "Reminds me of a stew I once had at a monastery up north on a night of rain and Gregorian chant." Then he served himself more, and then more again, and in the end he simply said, "Tonight's supper had soul." That night, I went to sleep with the scent of soup still clinging to the sleeves of my apron, and the priest's words echoing softly in my head. Had soul. It wasn't a compliment given often in the parish. Usually the bread was praised for being just right, or the broth for not being too thin. But soul was something else. It felt as if he had tasted something that came from inside me, not just from the pot. I smiled in the dark of my room, listening to the distant chirping of crickets and the soft crackle of wood burning itself out on the stove. Maybe, I thought, not everything that's missing is a loss. The next morning, with the sun still yawning behind the hills, I went to the market to buy salt. The vendor, a man of few words and many grains, handed me the package with an indifferent nod. I returned to the kitchen, determined to go back to the usual recipe, the traditional one, the safe one, the one I knew by heart. But as I prepared the soup, my hands hesitated. The jar of salt remained closed in the corner of the table, like a late guest. Instead, I repeated the gestures from the day before, the leaves, the vinegar, the blessing. And once again, the aroma filled the kitchen, as if to tell me it had found a new home. It didn't take long for others to notice. The altar boy, always curious, said the soup now had a mind of its own. The woman who cleaned the pews asked if I had started using sacred ingredients from some pilgrimage. Even the parish cat, An old tabby who rarely left the top of the stove began prowling the kitchen more often, as if sensing something had changed in the air, and the priest, discreet as ever, just smiled between spoonfuls, keeping that mystery to himself. A mystery seasoned with faith and improvisation. Then one Sunday, a widow brought a basket of homemade vinegar and herbs from her garden, saying she had heard of the priest's soup and wanted to contribute. The next week, a young man arrived with marjoram plants, and then a farmer with a bitter root of curious flavor. Little by little, the kitchen became a small sanctuary of silent offerings. Recipes were made with whatever was at hand, whatever arrived, whatever the season offered. And even though no one said it aloud, a new tradition was quietly being born within the parish's damp stone walls. I kept cooking the way one prays. Slowly, without guarantees, but with hope. With each new dish, a little uncertainty. With each new flavor, a small discovery. Sometimes it was too much vinegar that made us laugh. Other times, the scent of fresh herbs that stirred someone's old memories. One woman said a certain soup reminded her of childhood, when her mother boiled leaves to bring down a fever. Another swore she recognized the taste of an old love, and I, without meaning to, became less of a cook and more of a keeper of these palatable memories. I never told the priest that it all began by mistake, by absence, by haste. Somehow, he seemed to know. Sometimes he would glance at me over his glasses with a calm look, as if understanding without needing to hear. And I think that's how I learned one of life's sweetest truths, that it's not always the plan that carries us forward, but the courage to keep walking when the plan falls apart. It was the absence of salt that taught me the boldness of flavor, and the fear of failure that pushed me toward a success I never would have imagined. As the seasons passed, the parish became known for more than just its masses and ancient stained glass. Travelers who came from afar to hear the priest's words now also asked to taste the soup with soul. It was never the same, of course, never. But there was in it a constancy that didn't come from the ingredients, but from the gesture. A quiet care, a listening ear to what the land and the hands could offer, and that, curiously, was what nourished the most. Hunger of the body faded quickly, but the other, the kind that feeds on meaning, that one softened slowly with every spoonful. There was one particularly harsh winter when many ingredients withered too soon. The herbs dried on the branch, the jars sat nearly empty, and even the vinegar tasted too sharp. I thought of giving up, of going back to the salt, still untouched on the shelf. But in a half-stubborn gesture, I turned to the last dried leaves, added hot water and a bit of hardened bread. When I served it to the priest, he looked at the simple dish, inhaled the steam with closed eyes and said, "Tonight, the soup has silence." I smiled. Not every meal needs words. It was during that same winter that I began keeping small records of the dishes, not with measurements or precise recipes, but with memories. "The soup from the first frost," I wrote once, "the stew with shy roots" on another scrap of paper, and even the broth of homesickness after a pilgrim wept over his bowl. My notebooks didn't teach how to cook, but perhaps they taught how to remember, and that's what I wanted to leave behind. Not a manual, but a trail. Because I realized there among pots and words that cooking is also a way of writing, a language made of scent and waiting. Sometimes people ask how I started or where the idea came from to cook like this without salt, without rules. I just smile and tell with the same lightness one uses to describe a dream, about the day the shelf was empty and time ran faster than my steps, about the hesitant gesture, the vinegar dripping in fear, and the whispered prayer over the pot. And then I watch their eyes light up as if something in them too had once been missing and was filled by accident. Today, the recipe keeps changing. Sometimes more acidic, sometimes earthy, sometimes as gentle as dusk. And still, some say it always tastes the same, The taste of something that wasn't supposed to work but did. The taste of the unexpected, of improvisation done with care, of faith placed not in the result but in the trying. As if each spoonful gently said, "It's all right. Not everything needs to be perfect to be good." And I, who once feared mistakes, have learned to welcome them like an old friend, returning to remind me that life has its own seasonings. In that village, long after, I heard they still serve similar broths on cold days, that some of the older cooks call it soup of the soul, though no one really remembers why. I smile when I hear it, quietly, with a heart warmed like that soup that almost never was. Because I know that somewhere the salt that was missing that night became a bridge between scarcity and abundance, between fear and creation. And just as the priest once said, maybe the most important thing isn't what we put in the pot, but what we allow to simmer along with the heart. The visit that never came. In my village, among slanted rooftops covered in moss and alleys where time walks a little slower, there was a small house, its gate crooked, its garden always swept. It wasn't the prettiest nor the oldest on the street, but it was the one where silence seemed to have learned how to speak. That's where old Mr. Bartolomeu lived, a man of slow steps, neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that, though already clouded, still knew how to notice the world's little details with tenderness. He wore wool vests with mismatched buttons, sewn not by haste, but by memory. Every Sunday at sunrise, he performed the same ritual. The smell of freshly baked bread would escape through the windows, mingling with the cool breeze from the valley. On the dining table, worn but still sturdy, he'd lay a linen cloth embroidered by his late wife, 2 clay mugs, and a whole round loaf with a golden crust and soft center. He never cut the bread ahead of time. "It's disrespectful to break what hasn't yet been shared," he'd say, as one guarding something sacred. The chair beside his remained empty, yet it was always prepared with the same care. They say that many years ago, before my hair turned grey, Bartolomeu's son had left for distant lands, first in search of work, then perhaps in search of himself. Promises were made, letters, visits, a brief return, once the harvest is over. But the seasons passed, the rains changed moods, and the sun never came back. Still, every Sunday, like a priest before a humble altar, Bartolomeu readied the house as if that morning might bring reunion. He wiped down the front steps, aligned his shoes beside the door, straightened the stone bench under the lemon tree in the yard. The neighbors whispered among themselves with a mix of compassion and discomfort. "He's still waiting," they'd murmur while tending their gardens or hanging laundry. Some tried to persuade him otherwise, offering gentle advice or invitations to lunch meant to pull him from his waiting. But he politely declined, always with a slight smile. "Today is a visiting day," he'd say. It was hard to tell whether his voice held true hope or simply the sweetness of a habit too old to break. As the years passed, Sundays became almost a play performed for no one, yet always with the same precision. At 7, the kettle whistled. At 7:15, the bread was placed on the table. At 8, Bartolomeu would sit, fold his hands on his lap, and look toward the door, as if hearing footsteps only he could hear. At 9, with a quiet sigh, he would gather everything with the same gentleness he had set it down. No rush, no sorrow. Only the repeated care of someone who makes love a way of keeping time whole. The pigeons, drawn by the scent of bread and the forgotten crumbs, became faithful visitors of the backyard. Some, bolder, dared to peek through the living room window, beak to beak with the emptiness of the chair to Bartolomeu's right. He never shooed them away. On the contrary, he sometimes spoke to them softly, as if they were old companions. "You're waiting on someone too, aren't you?" he'd murmur as he crumbled a piece of bread on the sill. A small gesture, yet it revealed how he still saw companionship where others saw only absence. There was something deeply serene in his routine, as if Bartolomeu had made peace with time. not as an enemy, but as a guest who sits at the table, even when uninvited. Some afternoons I'd see him in the yard, sweeping dry leaves with slow, almost ceremonial motions. Other times, he'd wash the window that faced the street, polishing the glass as if, at any moment, his son might walk by and catch his reflection, and remember the way home. He cared for the house, like one tends an altar, not to impress, but to keep alive a spark of what had been lived. I especially remember one autumn when the leaves seemed more golden than usual. I was sitting on the low wall next door, watching Bartolomeo place 2 chairs by the gate. That's when he saw me, and with a rare gesture, waved me over. I sat beside him in silence. He offered me a slice of buttered bread and said only, "Life is made of arrivals, but also of waiting, and sometimes it's in the waiting that we live best." His words didn't sound sad. They were sweet, like the bread itself, and left a gentle taste of quiet acceptance. With time, I learned not to see sadness in Bartolomeo's repeated gestures, but rather a kind of unnamed faith, a discreet devotion to what still pulses even when no longer heard. He never mentioned his son's name, never showed photos, never told stories from the past. It was as if, by keeping silent, he stopped the memory from becoming frozen, allowing the son to continue growing, not in counted years, but in a recollection shaped by tenderness. The absence there wasn't a hole. It was a space held open, always ready to be filled. On rainy days, he would swap the fresh bread for toasted cornbread, sturdier against the damp air. The crumbs stayed untouched on the cloth, and the pigeons, more timid then, sheltered under the eaves. On those grey mornings, Bartolomeo would often light a small lamp and sit by the window with a blanket over his knees. Sometimes he'd hum lullabies no one else remembered, wordless verses that seemed made only to fill the space between one sigh and the next. The whole house smelled of warm bread, wood resin, and time gently tucked away. It wasn't rare for passing visitors to be puzzled by that solitary figure. Some, moved by the scene of the set table and empty chair, asked if they could help him find his son. Bartolomeo always thanked them with the same faint smile, as if the kindness was appreciated, but unnecessary. "He knows where my house is," he'd say, nodding toward the blooming lemon tree at the back of the yard. It was the only thing that seemed to resist time with the same grace he did. It bloomed every year, without fail, even when the cold came early or the sun lingered too long in hiding. One morning, I noticed something different. The table was not set. No bread had been bought, no tea brewed. The curtain remained drawn, and the gate was locked with the latch in place. My heart tightened, as if the silence of that house had begun to shout what no one wanted to hear. But as I drew near, I heard the soft creak of the door opening. Bartolomeo appeared, wrapped in an old shawl, and said with a tone almost playful, "He's not coming today, but maybe next time." And then, unhurriedly, he began sweeping the porch, as if brushing away not dust but the excess of expectations. After that day, I understood that absence was never a weight upon Bartolomeo's shoulders. It was more like a breeze beneath the door, invisible but steady. He didn't wait to be rewarded. He waited out of habit, out of love, from a loyalty perhaps only the old truly understand. Those who've learned that love isn't always about exchange, but about staying. Every Sunday the ritual continued, with small adjustments as the years went on. The cloth was replaced with one easier to wash. The bread came pre-sliced. The garden bench now had a soft cushion. And even when his body begged for more rest, even when his hands trembled pouring the tea or his legs faltered while sweeping the yard, Bartolomeo never abandoned his right. The chair beside him was still pulled out with care, the mug still placed on the same embroidered coaster. And every evening, he'd put everything away again with the patience of someone who still believes there's beauty in repetition. The world around him might change, but there, in that small patch of ground, Time bowed to the tenderness of a man who chose to remain. Years later, when Bartolomeu no longer swept the yard and the windows of the house remained closed for weeks, the village felt his absence in silence, like noticing that a candle has gone out in a dark room. There was no commotion, no ceremony, only a whispered rumor among neighbors and a respectful stillness surrounding that closed door. I was one of those who entered when distant relatives came to collect his belongings, and there on the table rested a neatly folded cloth, a clay mug, and one last loaf, hardened by time, still wrapped in an embroidered towel. In the backyard, beneath the lemon tree, I found two chairs leaning against one another, as if someone, before leaving, had wished to leave a message, that he waited until the very end. And perhaps it was just that. Bartolomeu didn't leave in sorrow. He left in faith, faithful to love, to memory, to the son who may never have returned, but who never lost his place at the table. Today, when I pass by his old house, I imagine the scent of baked bread on Sunday mornings, and I smile. Because in some quiet way, he is still there, gently pulling out the chair, serving tea with slow hands, and murmuring to the pigeons that the visit might still come.